I see that Thuli Madonsela had sent FW De Klerk very happy birthday wishes on his 85th birthday. Now, I must say, I'm not surprised or disappointed by the lady. She has disappointed me so many times, I didn't really expect anything different from her. But I did send her a tweet asking whether in all these happy, warm engagements that she has with Mr. De Klerk, even receiving a special award from the FW De Klerk Foundation, had she ever challenged him about his refusal to accept that apartheid was a crime against humanity? I do not expect an answer. I think Advocate Madonsela is far too much self-contained and self-absorbed in a happy appointment as a professor at the University of Stellenbosch through the assistance of the Stellenbosch mafia and white monopoly capitalism. I don't think she will respond to me. But I did respond to some of the tweets that I've received where people were asking me if I complain about FW De Klerk. Did I complain when Pik Botha joined the African National Congress and when other members of the National Party were allowed to join the ANC? And I answered that I most certainly and vociferously complained. It was totally unacceptable to me that an evil man such as Pik Botha, who had been for decades the main apologist on international platforms for apartheid, who had been a member of the State Security Council of the apartheid regime, where decisions were taken of cross-border raids among many other evil deeds to attack and kill members of the African National Congress and of Umkhonto we Sizwe in Botswana, in Lesotho, in Zambia, in Mozambique. A central, one of the most senior members of that State Security Council who took those decisions. I complained that he was allowed to become a member of the African National Congress. I think it is now common cause that Pik Botha was in some way or another involved in the assassination of Comrade Samora Machel. That the plane crash that killed Comrade Samora Machel and a number of other comrades was not an accident, but that it was carefully orchestrated by the apartheid security and intelligence forces. And Pik Botha's presence at the crash site so soon after that plane crashed is an indication of his own involvement. Now, how do you celebrate a man like that to be a member of your party and a liberation movement that had been fighting against the evil of apartheid? Similarly, how do you rejoice in members of the old National Party who transformed themselves into the so-called new National Party but clearly had no future, like Martinus Kortbroek van Schalkwyk and Gert Oosthuizen, being allowed to join the African National Congress, being given a new lease on political life when all the fit was out of their political futures. And not only to join the ANC, but to be given senior jobs such as minister and deputy minister in the national executive under the leadership of the African National Congress. I was deeply angered by those decisions, and up to this day, I maintain that it was wrong to have allowed them to join. Van Schalkwyk, in his early student days, was a spy for the intelligence services of the apartheid regime. He was not a progressive student. He presented himself as someone who was apparently interested in progressive thinking, while he was spying on those of us who really wanted to bring change within the student body in South Africa. I was one of the victims of his spying. How could I rejoice in him joining the African National Congress? Similarly, Gert Oosthuizen. He was a student at the old Rand Afrikaans University together with me, the same university that is now called the University of Johannesburg. He resisted change at the university. He fought me and other students who wanted to see the university being opened and for free and equal education. He fought us tooth and nail. He was a student resident in the same student residence where I was staying. And one night, he and some other reactionary students came into my room, pulled a pillowcase over my head, and gave me a beating with sawn-off pieces of hosepipe. I still have a scar on my nose. I had ribs broken and I had to spend a week in hospital. That is the Gert Oosthuizen I know. Now, after he was allowed to join the African National Congress, he would walk around at Parliament and in the corridors of Niehaus with a smirk on his face, calling me and others comrade. Whenever he addressed me as comrade, it made me bristle. It made my hair stand on end. I remember when I was in prison, serving a 15-year sentence for high treason, how I was taken to hospital for treatment for my ears because of the torture that I underwent when I was in detention and when I was tortured and interrogated. And as I was taken out of the prison van, in handcuffs and in leg irons, there on the Pretoria street, where the doctor's rooms were, on one of the jacaranda trees there was a poster with the smug face of Gert Oosthuizen, surrounded by the colors of the National Party. He was standing as a candidate for the National Party in the racist all-white elections that were taking place at that time. These are the people that unfortunately, through what I believe to have been a totally misguided decision, had been allowed to join the African National Congress. I've never accepted them as comrades, and I will never accept them as comrades. I never accepted their sincerity that they have changed. I've watched Mr. FW De Klerk in Parliament when he was Deputy President in the Government of National Unity under President Nelson Mandela. And I could see from all his actions, from his body language in the National Assembly, that the man had not changed at all. I recall a debate after one of President Nelson Mandela's State of the Nation speeches, addresses, where de Klerk was trying to justify some of the things that had happened during the apartheid era and was also trying to claim for himself accolades for having been the person, so he presented himself to be, that brought an end to apartheid. I was then still a member of Parliament. And when I stood up and I spoke, I reminded him of what his National Party under his leadership as president did during the time of negotiations. How they were involved in decisions to destabilize South Africa and specifically to destabilize the support base of the African National Congress. How they were involved in decisions to create a third force. The support that they had given for many, many years to Renamo in Mozambique, to destabilize Frelimo, and the terrible damage that they had caused to the lives of so many thousands of Mozambicans and the economy there. Instead of listening and taking in what I was saying, De Klerk jumped up from his seat, and as he was walking out of the National Assembly, he shouted, "I will not listen to this rubbish." I responded by saying to him, "Yes, Mr. De Klerk, walk your walk of shame." When I finished my speech, President Mandela, who was in the chamber, gestured to me that I should come and sit next to him. He whispered to me, "My boy," he always called me my boy, "I appreciate where you come from, but I think you went a bit far today. Perhaps you should go and apologize to Mr. De Klerk." I looked at President Mandela and said to him, "Please, Tata, do not ask that of me." He kept quiet, and I'm grateful that he never asked me again whether I had apologized, because I had not done so. I was not prepared to apologize to Mr. De Klerk for what I've told him, because what I said in that National Assembly, and which is still contained in the records of the Hansard, was the absolute truth. I think President Mandela understood where I came from, because I've watched President Mandela in various different situations having had to engage with Mr. De Klerk. I was present when he and Mr. De Klerk were together in Sweden, in Stockholm, where there was a dinner of honor for them as they were receiving the Nobel Peace Prize together. The tradition is, because Alfred Nobel was in fact Swedish and did not come from Norway, that the first part of the process of handing over the Nobel Peace Prize is always through a set of ceremonies and a dinner in Sweden. And then afterwards, the Nobel Peace Prize laureates traveled to Norway to receive finally the Nobel Peace Prize there. So at this dinner in Sweden, in Stockholm, President Mandela stood up to address the Prime Minister, the royal family, and all the highly placed guests were there. He had a written speech, but for some reason he decided to put the speech aside, and he started to speak from the heart. And he spoke about the terrible experiences that he had on Robben Island. What happened at the quarry, where the prisoners had to work and cut away at the limestone, how the fine dust of the limestone had damaged his and many other prisoners' eyes. How in the heat, in the middle of summer on that barren island, warders would force the prisoners to dig holes, to get into the holes and fill them up until only their heads were above the ground. And when they were pleading for water because of the terrible thirst that they were experiencing in that scorching sun, the warders would urinate on them. While President Mandela was telling all of this, I watched Mr. De Klerk sitting at the table opposite. He was bristling with anger. He was not listening. He was not understanding the terrible experiences that President Mandela had to go through and what so many other political prisoners who were incarcerated on Robben Island had to go through. No, not at all. He was only concerned about himself, about the negative impression that he felt was now being casted on him because of what President Mandela was saying. And of course, in usual fashion, at the end of having told these terrible stories of torture, of maltreatment, President Mandela looked over at De Klerk and said, despite all of this, despite what had been done to me and my fellow comrades, and he also pointed to Comrade Ahmed Kafrada, who was part of the delegation to go and receive the Nobel Peace Prize. We are prepared, for the sake of our people, to negotiate and to try and find peace in South Africa. De Klerk did not accept those words. He sat sulking at that table. The next morning, when I went to President Mandela's hotel room, because we stayed over in Stockholm, he showed me a note that de Klerk had sent him to his room that night after the function. And the note in de Klerk's handwriting was, "If you ever humiliate me in this way again, I will be forced to retaliate." I was shocked. I couldn't believe the arrogance of the man. So I asked President Mandela, "What are you going to do?" He looked at me and he gave me a wry smile and said, "My boy, I've already responded." I said to him, "Don't you dare remember what happened at Kudesa." And yes, we must remember what happened at Kudesa, because it helps to understand the relationship between President Mandela and FW De Klerk. During the first sessions of Kudesa, there was always an agreement that either President Mandela or de Klerk would be the last or final speaker in the opening session. But when the time came for President Mandela to be the last speaker, de Klerk's delegation, and amongst them was Pik Botha, no surprise, hey, again, serving his apartheid masters to the hilt. So that delegation, including Pik Botha, came to the ANC and said, "Look, de Klerk is still the president of the country. We request you to allow him to be the last speaker." We didn't want it. The delegation amongst us who were part of those negotiations, I can remember also Comrade Mac Maharaj saying, "But we have given an agreement that President Mandela will speak last at this session. We cannot change it." And it was then President Mandela who said, "Let's not be petty. Let's allow de Klerk to speak." And then at that session of Kudesa, using that last speaking position that he had, de Klerk decided to attack the African National Congress, decided to accuse us of all kinds of underhand activities, decided to undermine not only the African National Congress, but all of us as negotiators, and specifically President Mandela, who was sitting there listening to him. When de Klerk finished, President Mandela stood up. He was not supposed or due to speak again, but he stood up and he went to the podium. No one could stop him. And I remember how he started what he said there. He said, "Mr. de Klerk thought that he would be the last one to speak, and that he can insult me and the African National Congress. But here I am, and now I'm speaking." I think those of us who are old enough to remember that incident, remember how President Mandela spoke about de Klerk's duplicity, his lack of integrity, the many lies that he had told. He referred to the manner in which the National Party and the apartheid regime's security apparatuses were working together to build a third force in South Africa, to undermine and even with the intention to destroy the African National Congress. After he spoke, that particular session of Kudesa shattered. It came to an end. of course, the negotiations were picked up again. But these two incidences that I'm referring to give one a bit of an understanding of the relationship that there was between President Mandela and FW De Klerk. I do not believe that Madiba for one moment trusted De Klerk. I do not believe that for one moment he truly wanted to accommodate De Klerk. But we were in a difficult situation for negotiations. The African National Congress was going to be the ruling party. That was evident after the first democratic elections had taken place. But it was also a situation where we had to acknowledge that the ANC had not won against the National Party and the apartheid regime in a war. That the National Party still continued, especially through the security forces, to wield significant power. And in the negotiations, we had to find ways to take the process forward so that we could eventually get to the point of the elections on the 27th of April, 1994. I'm not one of those who is prepared to say that President Mandela and those who negotiated with him sold out. I am, however, one of those who is prepared to say that all of us who had been part of that negotiating process, and I myself was a junior member of the negotiating team, had given away far too much. What happened with regards to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what happened with regards to the acceptance of the sunset clauses, and especially the acceptance of the sunset clauses without clear mechanisms of how to phase out those sunset clauses, that they would not continue to impact on our ability to bring fundamental change in South Africa, were terrible mistakes that had been made. The TRC itself was a terrible mistake. But it was a mistake that flowed from a very difficult situation that we found ourselves in when it was clear close to the end of the negotiations that there were those in the Defence Force, in the old South African Defence Force, collaborating with the retired head of the Defence Force, General Constant Viljoen, to bring about a coup, and that they were only prepared to move away from doing so if they were given guarantees of amnesty. The agreement for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to come about was part of the process of avoiding a military coup by the old South African Defence Force. And unfortunately, the sad reality was that at that stage, the South African Defence Force, if they were able to mobilize and proceed with the coup, would probably have been able, at least in the interim, to succeed and to prevent the elections that were held eventually on the 27th of April 1994 to proceed. So a compromise was made, but a terrible and bitter compromise that allowed evil people who've committed horrible crimes against humanity to be able to get amnesty. That simultaneously also allowed members of the African National Congress who had fought for the liberation of this people and for the empowerment of black and especially African South Africans to be treated as if whatever actions they were involved in were similar to the terrible apartheid crimes that had been committed by these apartheid operatives. We recall how horrible the session was where Comrade Winnie Madikizela Mandela was forced to sit there in front of that commission as an accused on the basis of fake stories, of Stratcom lies that had been told about her, and that she was responsible for the killing of Stompie Siphe. I recall what happened that day when Archbishop Desmond Tutu demanded of Comrade Winnie Madikizela Mandela that she had to apologize. It is as if it is today that I saw the pain and the tears in her eyes when she told him, "How dare you expect of me, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, to apologize for the struggle that I conducted against apartheid." It was one of the most shameful phases in our history. And up to this day, I cannot forgive Archbishop Desmond Tutu for what he did there to one of the greatest heroes of our liberation struggle. But let me return to FW De Klerk, because De Klerk was also meant to appear in front of that commission. He made some submissions, and the TRC found that he was less than frank with him. In fact, that he presented lies to try and absolve himself from his involvement in the crimes that had been committed under apartheid, and especially his involvement in the third force that had its reign of terror during the negotiating process. Also, his involvement with regards to the decisions that led to many massacres, but specifically also the Boy Patong massacre. So when we talk about the apartheid criminals that are still amongst us, or when we are confronted by the death of one of those criminals, as was the case with Pik Botha, we have to ask ourselves over and over again, have we allowed these people to get away with some of the most heinous crimes imaginable? How is it possible that we allowed them to live easy lives, happy lives, in a post-apartheid democratic South Africa? I see that FW De Klerk announced through the FW De Klerk Foundation that he suffers now from cancer. At the age of 85, I suppose, sometime in the not too distant future, we will be faced with him having died. Are we going to celebrate this man's life when that happens? Are we going to give him the accolades and the treatment of a former president and former deputy president, which he was under the government of national unity? Are we going to celebrate a criminal who committed crimes against humanity? I have to ask these questions, because when Pik Botha died, our president sent a message of condolences. When General Constant Viljoen died, our president sent a message of condolences. In fact, describing Constant Viljoen, who was prepared to bring about a coup against the negotiating process and who blackmailed us in the African National Congress to give him and his cronies amnesty, describing him as one of the people who helped to bring about peace in South Africa. surely it can't. Surely in the context of what we have experienced from the majority of white South Africans since 1994, the lack of contrition, the lack of preparedness to accept their guilt, the way in which they had benefited from apartheid, and because those benefits last for all their lifetimes, that they still continue to be the benefactors of apartheid. Surely we can't, when they die, celebrate their lives. The project for reconciliation with the majority of white people in this country has failed dismally. The majority of whites in this country have benefited from the end of apartheid, have seen themselves being able to now travel the world, freed from sanctions, and especially economic sanctions. They have prospered economically because of the end of apartheid. But most of them have never decided to bury apartheid and to accept that because of what happened, it is necessary for them to pay restitution to the majority of black and especially African people. A number of years ago, I was part of a campaign that was called the Home for All campaign. It had a very simple but sincere message, calling on people in the white community to acknowledge their guilt under apartheid, to acknowledge that they have benefited from the terrible apartheid system, that as benefactors of apartheid they had better education, better health care, better accommodation. In fact, everything in their lives were better. That now it was necessary for them to acknowledge their guilt, but as part of that guilt, also to agree to restitution. Myself and the few South Africans who were pushing for that Home for All campaign and that declaration, and who asked white South Africans to sign that declaration, were vilified. We were called all kinds of names. And as I see South Africa developing and unfolding today, I see that the benefits of apartheid, that the white community still continue to draw on every day, still continues to place them in an entirely more privileged position than the majority of black and especially African people. Our economy is still white dominated. In fact, white monopoly capitalism has a strangled grip of this economy. The vast majority of black and African people continue to be exploited and oppressed, are not able to be in charge of the economy of their country. In fact, during the last few years, we've even seen reverses on the little bit of advance that we made since 1994 in terms of economic empowerment. We've seen vicious attacks on black executives and on black excellence. During the last year of COVID-19, we've seen that emergency funds that were made available disproportionately went not to black, but to white entrepreneurs and to white businesses. Those who were devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic consequences are mostly black and African people. And whites are arrogant. They celebrate this new sense that they have that they are getting back into charge of our country. They celebrate a sense that the liberation movement's ideals have been put on hold or has even been reversed. One of the most hurtful tweets that I've received recently was from a white man who said to me, "We are back in charge and tough for all of you who don't like it." So my dear friends, you've asked me a question, I've given you a long answer. No, I have never and I will never celebrate the positions that members of the old apartheid regime, members of the National Party, or even when they called themselves the so-called New National Party, had received within the African National Congress. I opposed it, and I will continue to oppose it. I was myself hoping for our country to find a way for the white community to acknowledge its guilt and to work for restitution. They have failed to do so. The Mandela Project of reconciliation had failed. We're no longer there. Now the time has arrived to do something different, to restructure our economy in a fundamental way, to make sure that radical economic transformation takes place, that land restitution without compensation happens, that white people, if they do not want to listen, are being dealt with harshly, that those who continue to be racist must face the full wrath of the law, that racists must be arrested, charged and imprisoned, that those who do not want to listen have to feel. The time for playing games, the time for going on the soft pedal with an arrogant white population who have not changed, the majority of whom continue to think of themselves as white supremacists and better than the majority of black and African people. It is simple. They've been given more than enough opportunity. They've been given every chance possible. If they do not want to listen, if they are not prepared to change, the time had come for them to feel the consequences of their intransigence.